Okay, we're recording. So, so thanks for logging in. I hope you're having a good week so far. Um, what we're going to do today is continue our discussion of the government, kind of the basics, how things are meant to work when they wrote the Constitution back in 1787. Um, I get all excited sometimes about how I think wise they were when they could almost practically see into the future to um, oh, somebody's got some noise here. Um, they could, they really gave it a lot of thought, and when they wrote the Constitution, and so they looked into the future and said, okay, this is the government that we want. How can we ensure that this will continue to work into the indefinite future? Forever. I presume they would hope. Um, so they made decisions. They structured the government in a certain way. Of course, we've seen there's three branches. Today we're going to look at the third branch of government, which is, if you read the Constitution, it's Article 3, the third branch of government. Now, we always say there are three co-equal branches of government. So they're not meant to be uh, one more powerful than the other. That we've talked about. We'll continue to talk about checks and balances and the balance of power among the three branches of government. But the judicial branch we're going to discuss today is one that is easily forgotten because we see the president, we see the Congress members, um, but by design you don't really see the Supreme Court and courts. You read about court cases, big and small, in your newspaper, see them online, see them in the news, but the court system is not as in your face as the executive branch and the legislative branch, but it is important. They are three co-equal branches. So that's what we're going to discuss today. Um, Before we do, there's a lot of news going on right now. What are the two big things that happened this week as far as national government goes?
I think Trump was mm, like he was not guilty. They pronounced that. Is that true?
Right, yeah. So in December, he was impeached in the House of
Yeah.
Representatives, which just means basically accused of doing something. Now, that's a fact. He was impeached. But a lot of people think impeached means removed from office, but that's not it. It's two different things. So now, over the last couple of weeks, he's been having that impeachment trial in the Senate. The 100 senators, two from every state, gather together and have a very solemn and serious trial. And so they've had that. They did the final vote yesterday afternoon. And there's two, what they call articles of impeachment, the two different things he was accused of doing. And on both, they failed to, the Democrats, it shouldn't really be Democrat and Republican, voting straight along their party. They should really be independently deciding, did he do these things? Does it earn removal from office? But the way things are, they really do stick to their party. So um, all the Democrats voted guilty on both counts, but there's only 47 Democrats, and they need 67 out of 100. They need a 2/3 majority to vote guilty in order to remove him from office. So all the Democrats on the first article of impeachment, the abuse of power, all the Democrats plus one Republican voted guilty, and all the Republicans other than that one voted not guilty. And on the second article of impeachment, the obstruction of Congress, which is like obstruction of justice only when it's through Congress, they call it obstruction of Congress. it was what they call us down straight party lines. It was all the Democrats voted guilty, all the Republicans, including that one, all the Republicans voted not guilty. So they didn't meet the 67 votes majority, so he was found not guilty on both. So that's historic. Um, that was the Constitution playing out. That was how how that was meant to play out. So that's our Constitution at work. That's historic. That was a big deal. What was the other thing on the national government level that happened this week?
Oh, I don't know.
The Iowa, what is it called?
The Iowa caucuses. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, that started this week. So, actually, let me jump out here to a website I found. This website, I haven't really looked it over super closely to make sure that it's 100% true and accurate and fair, but it does look pretty good. It's 272win.com. Now that's in reference to the 270 electoral college votes that the president, somebody needs to win to become president. Now we will talk about the electoral college someday. But it's in reference to how exactly you win a presidential election. And I was wondering, so Iowa starts with caucuses, here's the calendar. They started with February 3rd. Now, what this is deciding is, and there's some states do what they call caucuses, most states do what they call primaries. In both situations, both types, what they're doing is they are selecting within each party who they want to run for president at the election in November. So this is Democrats choosing their favorite Democrat, Republicans choosing their favorite Republican. Now, since President Trump is the incumbent, which means he's the person holding that office, it's very unlikely that anybody would be the Republican nominee besides him. I would say it's a pretty much guarantee that Trump will be the Republican nominee. But the Democrats are very much up in the air. There's still a dozen people running for president on the Democratic side. And so each state does a primary election, although a caucus is a little bit of a different type of system. But Pennsylvania does a primary. So I looked it up. And on April 28th, here's Pennsylvania, April 28th, we will, which is what? Tuesday, April 28th, Pennsylvania will have our primary. So Republicans can go and vote for the Republican they want to run for president, and Democrats can go and vote for Democrats, the one Democrat they want to run for president. And then, those winners, the Republican and the Democrat, are in the general election in November. So it's very early on. Every state has one, plus all the couple of territories, Guam, Puerto Rico. Even though they do vote in the presidential election, but basically their votes kind of don't matter. But all the 50 states have a primary. As you can see from the calendar, these are all the dates when the primaries happen. So we're just getting started. This is going to be big news, continuing to be big news. February, March, April, May, a couple in June, and then in July, the blue tends to be the color for Democrats, red is the color for Republicans. In July, the Democrats have their national convention where they will officially name their Democratic nominee for president. And in August, the Republicans have their convention where I presume they will name President Trump as the Republican nominee. And then we go September, October, there's some debates. That's what these dates are on the calendar. And then Tuesday, November 3rd is the general election. So pretty big week of news. Plus, you throw in Groundhog's Day on Sunday, and you know, Punxsutawney Phil. What did he not see did he see his shadow? I think he didn't see his shadow, so that means we will have an early spring. Is that right?
Having
Yeah, that's what I heard.
that's what
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, that's extremely scientific, I'm sure. But yeah, Groundhog's Day is fun too. So yeah, big week in news. You got a presidential impeachment trial and Groundhog's Day and all that fun stuff. Any questions? I think it'd be nice to talk about the election, the primary system, how it works. We'll talk about that in detail, maybe even next week, sometime soon. Um, but any questions before we get started on the judicial system?
No.
No? Okay. Okay.
There was also the State of the Union address.
Oh, right. Yeah, the State of the Union address. Now, as a historical person, I think the State of the Union, it is in the Constitution. I think I mentioned this last week. It is in the Constitution that the president has to address Congress once a year. They don't say in January, but they say at least once a year, the president has to make an address to Congress about the state of the union. The state meaning kind of the status of things, how things are. And the union means our union of states, our country, the United States. I think historically in the 1790s, 1800s, I think that was more important to do. Today, we've got news, 24-hour news, it seems, on every channel. We've got newspapers, websites, Twitter. There's no question of what's going on. The people in Congress know precisely what's going on with the president. So that speech is not as important, not as meaningful, I think, as it was at the time when they wrote that into the Constitution. But it's a chance. Oh, I think I told you last week about that show on Netflix. What is it? Designated Survivor, right? I think it's because of like that show. It's interesting that the whole government is there, all in one place to hear the president speak. Um, I'm just curious, did anybody check out that show on Netflix?
No, I don't have Netflix. I didn't check it
Um,
out.
I'm sure I don't have Netflix, so
Oh, okay.
haven't
Well,
seen it.
yeah, it was just something I got all excited about. Maybe I'm overly excited about government-related TV dramas. But okay, so the judicial system. Let's look at kind of the big picture here first. What we're going to talk about is the federal, meaning national court system. Then there's kind of layers to it. Okay. Now, if this would not be the case if I say ran a red light and got a speeding ticket. There's zero chances that that case would ever get up to the Supreme Court. But if I was, pulled over by a police officer and I felt that it was because of the color of my skin, then that involves not just breaking the law, maybe I ran a red light, maybe I didn't, but it involves a civil liberty, a personal liberty. And so I could make the case that my civil liberties were broken, were infringed upon, were harmed. And so I could go to court. And if you lose in the American system, if you lose in a court case, you can always appeal upwards to the next bigger court. And they can either agree to hear your case again, in which case you pretty much, sometimes you go through the whole case again, sometimes they just kind of read the notes from the trial, or that higher court that I have appealed to can just say no, and in which case the last court that I was in that ruling stands. It stays. That's the permanent decision. Okay. So you have the county court system. If you break, if you get a speeding ticket, you're probably going to go to your county court. Every county has a county courthouse. Maybe it's in the biggest town in your county. Maybe it's not. But you have a county courthouse. You're probably familiar with your county courthouse. Then we get into the real national, the federal court system. There are 94 district courts. There are 3 in Pennsylvania. And here's a map, and this is the geographical areas of the 3 district courts in Pennsylvania. If you break a state law, this is, I think, where you're going to go. Okay. Above that, we have 13 federal circuit courts. Now, if you break a federal law, I believe this is where you're going to go. Like if you make terroristic threats of somebody, if you, a lot of times, any federal law, if there's a national law about something and you break that national law, you're going to go to a federal, I believe you're going to go to a federal circuit court. So things like civil liberties, First Amendment rights, if there's a national law about it and you break that federal law, this is where you go. Now, all of these things, as we've read about checks and balances, and we're going to read about them in a little bit here, one of the main checks and balances that the other 2 branches of government have on the judicial branch is that the president appoints all these judges. Some judges are elected, like your county judges might be elected, which kind of is weird to elect a judge. How do you know? But some lower, local judges are elected officials. But the federal judges are all appointed by the president and approved of or disapproved of by the Senate. That's in the Constitution. It's a checks and balances. The 3 branches of government are working together, and it's a spreading out of the power. So the president has already appointed, in his first 3 years of office, has appointed hundreds of judges. Okay, these 13 federal circuit courts, there's 94 district courts, and each of these have, it's not just one judge, it's probably a group of judges, 3 or sometimes even 5 judges working together. And when there's an opening, if somebody retires, they're appointed for life. When somebody retires or dies, then there's an opening and the president names somebody to take that job. And then the Senate has a hearing, maybe talks to that person, maybe they call that person in, maybe they don't, but they discuss that person. Basically, it's a job application, and is this a good person for this job? One thing that President Trump has in to his favor right now is that the Senate is a majority Republican. So anybody he nominates for a judge or Supreme Court justice, on the Supreme Court we call them justices, I don't know that they have turned down, well, I think they have, but very few, very seldom does the Senate not accept the person that the president has. This Senate, because they're Republican and he's Republican, very seldom do they say no to anybody he names. So you have the 13 federal circuit courts, and then we have the Supreme Court of the United States. There's 9 justices. There have been more. There have been up to 12 before. But Congress can pass a law, and this is in the Constitution. It's Congress controls, in a way, in some ways, the Supreme Court. They said 12 is too many. They landed, I forget when, but a long time ago, they landed on 9 as being the perfect number. Why would you always want to have an odd number? Why would you want to have an odd number? And folks sometimes actually, Noma, thank you for logging in. You got a little bit of background noise, so sometimes if I hear noise, and I do this with other people sometimes, I might click you on mute. So when I ask a question, you got to make sure you're not muted. So check if you're muted. But let me ask, why would they want 9 Supreme Court justices instead of 8 or 10?
I think when they vote for something, if they have 9, it's easier to make decision like 5 against 4. If they have equal like 8 or 10 and they vote for something, they can get 4 against 4 and it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, exactly. So if you have an even number, you might have a tie. And if there's a tie, that's a bit confusing. So they keep an odd number of justices on the Supreme Court in order to avoid ties. And so they will hear. I was reading something to prepare for this morning, and I think each year they have about 8,000 cases come to them. Okay. Well, you can't hear and make wise decisions on 8,000 cases a year. So they choose about 80 to 100. So kind of 1%. If your case gets to the Supreme Court or appeals to the Supreme Court, you have about a 1% chance of them actually taking it up and saying, yes, we want to talk about this case. So it's very rare, very difficult for you to get a case heard by the Supreme Court, but about 80 to 100 cases a year. Now, they're not having a full-blown trial. They do not come in and have witnesses and, did you see the murder happen? Like, they're not doing that. They will have the judge or the lawyers from both sides come in and they have a discussion. Now, according to tradition, I don't know if there's laws about it, but there are not cameras in the Supreme Court when they have their discussions. Sometimes you can hear audio recordings, but there are not cameras in the Supreme Court. So often if it's on the news, you get like the court artists, how they like sketch the people in a court. There are not cameras in the Supreme Court. But they'll hear cases, they'll question the lawyers, well, why are you saying this and why are you saying that and what do you think about this? And they have a lot of very lawyerly, very legal type discussions that, I'm sure I wouldn't understand any of it. But they talk about, is this constitutional? Is it not constitutional? We'll talk about that in a minute. And then they say, okay, thank you. And then they go back and then months later, they will issue a ruling. So getting to the Supreme Court's a pretty slow deal and very difficult. Like I said, there's 8,000 applications or appeals to the Supreme Court every year. They take about 1% of those. So that's the Supreme Court. The two tallest men in the back, Neil Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, are the two nominees from President Trump. So he's nominated 2. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the little lady in the chair, they're all, you can see they're not young people. She's in her 80s, and there's some people worried about her health, and if she were to die, whoever's president at that time gets to nominate. It's very rare for a president to appoint 3 judges. That's a third of the bench, that they say, appointed by a single president, and that'd be a pretty rare opportunity for one president. Okay, so that's the Supreme Court. Here's the Supreme Court building. You can certainly walk past it in Washington, D.C. The court tries to not make a big deal out of itself. They try to just kind of quietly go about their business. You do not see the Supreme Court justices on the news talking about things. Like, that's not their role. When you're a Supreme Court justice, you're not supposed to be out there, talking on the nightly news about your opinions. You just do your job quietly. It's a lifetime appointment. Um, so anyway, that's the Supreme Court. So let's do some reading. Here's if you send me an email, then actually let me put that in the chat. Let me put my email. If you send me an email, even right now if you want, I'll email you this document. Here's a couple of, I think, 2 articles and a video that are about the court system, and it's some pretty good information. But we're going to look at ushistory.org like we have in the past. This is the power of the federal courts. So it's going to discuss like what the courts do, like what is their role in the government, how does it work, what powers do they have. But let's scroll down and see what the topics might be. So we'll probably have an introduction here, and then we have checks on judicial power, right? Checks and balances, the power of the courts, and then judicial activism versus judicial restraint. So those are the topics. I think that's the end. Those are the topics we're going to tackle here. And I think it's 11:30. I guess I've been talking a while, but I think we can get through most of it. So we can take turns. If you have a microphone, super. If not, then I guess you can't read, and that's okay too. So Jennifer, could you read the first paragraph for us? Do you have a microphone, Jennifer? Oh, maybe not. Carla, could you read the first paragraph?
Sure. Not everyone agrees on how much power the judicial branch should have. After all, federal judges and justices are appointed, non-elected, right?
Yes.
As most Americans believe in democracy, shouldn't elected officials run the country? On the other hand, perhaps American government would be fairer if judges had even more power, because they do not have to worry about re-election. They have relieved of the outside pressure of public opinion.
Okay, thank you. So federal judges are appointed for life. And so the thinking there is that they don't have to worry about keeping people happy. And we've seen the president is elected every 4 years. The House of Representatives is elected every 2 years. And does anybody remember how often the people in the Senate run for re-election?
Every 6.
6
Yeah,
every 6 years.
Yeah. So the thinking there, depending the frequency with which you have to worry about re-election is directly related to how much you care about, really, I guess, how much you care about the people. Representatives in the House of Representatives are supposed to care greatly about keeping us happy, doing the things that we want, because if we don't like what they do, we're not going to re-elect them. Senators, same thing, but they have 6 years. They don't have to worry about, House of Representatives, they're basically always running for re-election because of the way things go now. So like every 2 years, that's pretty often. Senators worry about it a little bit less, and they try to make long-term wise decisions. A Supreme Court justice wasn't elected and never will be re-elected. So not that they want to make stupid decisions that make people unhappy, but they're not trying to just keep people happy. What would be their, hopefully, their top priority? What's the number one thing they care about? A Supreme Court
About
justice.
justice,
Yeah, justice based on what?
they care about law. Everyone is following law.
Right, the law. And of course, at that level, they're not talking about laws like speeding tickets or, driver's license. They're thinking the Constitution, right? So
Constitution.
their number one, the only thing they should really be thinking about is this case before me breaking or going against the US Constitution? Now, these people are incredibly smart, incredibly well studied. They know everything about what they're talking about. So the only thing they consider is this going against the Constitution? Not how is this gonna, well, sometimes they do think, how is this going to affect people's lives? Sort of. But they're not saying, oh, are Democrats going to like this? Are Republicans going to like this? Not a concern because they're appointed for life. And so like Carla said, they're relieved of outside pressure of public opinion. Nadia, could you read the next paragraph? After all.
Yes, after all, the majority is not always right. It is no accident that the founders provided for elected officials in the legislature and appointed officials in the judiciary. They believe that freedom, equality, and justice are best achieved by the balance between the two branches of government.
Okay, so it is a balance of power. The legislative branch, the elected officials, and the appointed officials. Okay, so balance of power is, we say it a lot, but it really was a big thing that they considered because, think back, 1787, who were they breaking away against? They're creating a new government. What was the old government that they had? When they were English, they had a king, a monarch in a monarchy. And a king in a monarchy can do basically, kind of, whatever he wants. He's not bound by a constitution. So they wanted the opposite of that. They wanted to fix that problem. And so they created three branches of government that were all locked together in these checks and balances. So that's what their design was. Noma, could you read the next paragraph, the President and Congress? Do you have your microphone ready? Noma? How about you, Tololupe? Could you get that? Read that
Yes.
paragraph? All right, thank you.
The President and Congress have some control of the judiciary with their power to appoint and confirm appointments of judges and justices. The Congress also may impeach judges. Only 7 have actually been removed from office, alter the organization of the federal court system, and amend the Constitution.
Okay, why don't you read the next 2 paragraphs too? They're kind of short.
Okay. Congress can also get around a court ruling by passing a slightly different law than the one previously declared unconstitutional. Courts also have limited power to implement the decisions that they make. For example, if the president or another member of the executive branch chooses to ignore a ruling, there is very little that the federal courts can do about it.
Okay. Actually, read one more paragraph because that'll finish that section. For example.
Okay. For example, the Supreme Court ruled against the removal of the Cherokee from their native lands in 1831. President Andrew Jackson disagreed. He proceeded with the removal of the Cherokee, and the Supreme Court was powerless to enforce its decision.
Okay, thank you. So that's all the checks and balances on the judicial branch, on judicial power. Congress can impeach judges, and it's happened. 7 have been removed. There's been more than that that haven't been removed. Congress can impeach a judge. It'd be interesting to learn, more about those cases. Why? What does it take to get somebody removed from uh, a judgeship? But if Congress decides somebody's doing it inappropriately, now that's a pretty big deal for a job that's appointed for life. But that's a power that's given to Congress. If a law is declared unconstitutional, then Congress can pass a different law. For instance, when very shortly after taking office, President Trump issued his travel ban on, I think, 7 different countries. Well, people said, well, those are Muslim countries. And since he, as a candidate for president previously, he had discussed banning Muslims from entering the country, people said, oh, this is that. So they sued. People who were blocked from entering the country sued the government, saying that their rights were infringed upon. It was unconstitutional. I forget what it was, a circuit judge or pretty high up. It wasn't the Supreme Court, but I think a circuit judge ruled that yes, it was unconstitutional. And so the Trump administration went back and rewrote the law slightly. And I think that happened a couple of times before a judge said, okay, finally, this is not unconstitutional anymore. So now that was the president not really writing a law. That was what you call an executive order, which is very similar to a law, but the president does it instead of Congress. But Congress also, if something is declared unconstitutional, they can write a little bit different law that does the same thing, but maybe in a way that's a little bit more allowable. The courts also really don't have a way to enforce the laws. And so we get the example of President Andrew Jackson in the 1830s. This is a time President Andrew Jackson, I think he was president for 2 terms in the 1820s and 30s, and he was not a friend of the Native Americans. And so they were in Georgia and Florida in the American South. And so there was pressure. It's actually a really interesting story with the Cherokees. You think of, picture a Native American in your mind, right? They have a particular culture. They have their own culture. And throughout American history, even back when America wasn't America, before it was America, when it was British colonies, there's always been conflict, or back then there was always conflict with Native Americans. And so America's history with Native Americans is not very pretty. And so there was pressure on the Cherokees to abandon their own way of life and just try to fit in with American white, generally, white American society. And so they did. The Cherokees largely, and the Cherokee tribe, more than other Indian tribes, became Christian, started farming when they traditionally were not farmers. They did a lot of things to fit into the white American culture of the 1820s and 1830s, even to the point of buying and owning slaves. They owned black slaves because they're like, gee whiz, we're just trying to fit in, to try to be a part of American society. And of course, at the time, part of white American society was owning slaves a lot of the time, especially in the South, where they were in the South. The Cherokees tried very hard to fit in, and yet even for all that effort, Andrew Jackson led the charge against the Native Americans and removed them from the American South, from Florida, Georgia, um, Louisiana area, that deep American South, rounded them up, forced them to march across the Mississippi into the Great Plains. And that's where a lot of Native Americans are now, because they were moved there from the American South. Well, the Supreme Court stepped in and said, no, you can't do that. You can't, America has a history of signing treaties with these Native Americans, and we, haven't always treated them perfectly, but we, maybe we try. And so the Supreme Court said removing the Cherokee from their native lands is illegal. And President Jackson said, I forget who the Supreme Court Chief Justice was, but there's a famous quote where he says, the Chief Justice has made his ruling, now let's see him enforce it. Basically, he's saying, I don't care, to the Supreme Court. So he was ruled, what he was doing was illegal, and he still did it. He removed the Cherokee across the Mississippi, literally marched families 1,000 miles to the Great Plains, where their ancestors are today. So the Supreme Court can say something's illegal, can say it's unconstitutional, but the whole American system is based on the idea that we will respect that, right? The only reason a red light traffic light works is because we all respect it. If you pull up to a traffic light, it happens all the time, right? Like at night, if you're coming home from someplace at night, it happens all the time. You pull up to a red light, there's nobody around, like nobody. It's the middle of the night, you're at a red light for no reason. Do you still wait at the red light, or do you run the red light? I'd say the vast majority of us sit there in the dark, sitting at a red light, even though there's no danger, right? But the American law system is based on the fact that we all will follow the law. We're naturally inclined to follow the law. Well, President Jackson in that case didn't follow the law. And there really were no repercussions. He wasn't punished. He did remove the Cherokee from their native lands. So that's an interesting case there for Andrew Jackson in the Supreme Court. What he was doing, the Supreme Court said was illegal, and he said okay, and he still did it. So there's limits to the checks and balances. Sometimes you can, if you're the executive branch, you can still win because the court says what you're doing is illegal, and you say, I don't care, I'm going to keep doing it. And there's really not much that can happen. What do we got? Four paragraphs. Carla, why don't you read these first two paragraphs, please?
Okay. The federal court's most important power is that of judicial review, the authority to interpret the Constitution when federal judges rule that laws or government actions violate the spirit of the Constitution. They profoundly shape public policy. For example, federal judges have declared over 100 federal laws unconstitutional. Another measure of the Supreme Court's power is its ability to overrule itself. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka that schools segregated by race were unconstitutional. This reversed the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision that upheld the doctrine of separate but equal.
Okay, so the idea that we all kind of Thank you very much. The idea that we all think of these, especially the higher courts, the Supreme Court, the reason, when they say something is unconstitutional, the reason we care is because of the idea of judicial review. It's what they do. They decide if something, as I highlighted, violates the spirit of the Constitution. The First Amendment, and we could talk about the amendments someday. First Amendment rights of religious freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. If something violates freedom of speech, they're going to get involved and they care. It violates the spirit of the Constitution, so they can rule a law unconstitutional, which means that law then disappears as a law. They can also overrule itself. They can reverse their thinking from the past. 1896, you have Plessy versus Ferguson, which established the idea of separate but equal. 1896. So then you have, and you've probably seen pictures like through the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. You've probably seen those pictures of the water fountains that say whites only or whites and coloreds, and there's public bathrooms for white people and black people. They're separate, and it was supported by the courts, the law, separate but equal. There was, and so then it gets to schools, and every town, especially down south, every town would have a school for the white kids and the families and a school for the black kids. Well, you don't have to be a genius to think, okay, which of those schools over time is probably going to be nicer, with better funding, with better education. The white school is going to end up being the better school just because that's the way things go in history. So then you have 1954, the Supreme Court case, a case gets to the Supreme Court, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka. This is Topeka, Kansas. A little girl and her family sued the school board, the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, because she wanted to go to the best school in the city, which was the school for the white kids. And so her lawyer, she didn't, I think it was a little girl. I don't suppose she did much talking, but her lawyers argued that separate but equal separate does not mean equal. It does not work that way. They said, look around the country, separate but equal is not an honest thing. And so that ended segregated schools. And so through the 1950s, even it started a little bit even before that, 40s, 50s, into the 60s, you have an end of segregation. Those whites only water fountains or the whites only restaurants or Rosa Parks sitting wherever she chooses on a public bus in Mississippi. The civil rights movement is happening in the 50s and 60s, and it happens largely through the courts. And that's the case. Brown versus Board of Education and Plessy v. Ferguson are two things that, the court system changed its own mind, essentially, over time. Okay, so let me finish. It says, for the most part, though, federal courts do have a great deal of respect for previous decisions. A very strong precedent called stare decisis, which is Latin for let the decision stand, directs judges to be cautious about overturning decisions made by past courts. That's another foundational principle in the court system. If a previous court has already decided something, maybe not even if I'm a judge, maybe not me, but even another court. If I'm a district judge in Pennsylvania and I have a court case about a particular topic, somebody is suing somebody about this particular type of freedom of speech. If I know that in 1980 on the other side of the country, there was a court case about this very topic, very similar case or something about freedom of speech. I need to think long and hard if I'm going to contradict that and go against it. So you follow a previous precedent. Okay, precedent, pre means before. So precedent is something that comes before. So to follow a legal precedent means if this type of question has already been answered by another court case, I should really just go with that. Sometimes, like in Brown versus Board of Education, sometimes you have people overthrowing a previous precedent. But most often, under the idea of stare decisis, which just means, follow the previous precedent. Think long and hard before you overdo something or overthrow a decision. So in a nutshell, that's a kind of detailed. Oh, you know what? We have, well, judicial, I guess we have judicial activism versus judicial restraint. We could touch on this in the future. This is the idea. Well, maybe I could just talk about it. Judicial activism versus judicial restraint is very simply, judicial activism means, it says judicial activists believes that the federal courts must correct injustices that are perpetuated or ignored by the other branches. So whenever a judge is making rulings that are changing, really truly changing laws, then people will say you're an activist judge. A lot of times, and it's often social things. Gay marriage, when that changed and that became federal law several years ago, people say, well, those were activist judges changing the law. The opposite of that would be judicial restraint. Restraint means to hold back, right? So judicial restraint would mean don't change much, be cautious, move things slowly. It says supporters of judicial restraint point out that appointed judges are immune to public opinion, and if they abandon their role as careful and cautious interpreters of the Constitution, they become unelected legislators. So somebody who believes in judicial restraint would say you follow previous precedent, you don't pass rulings, you don't overthrow laws as unconstitutional very often. You have to move things slowly, make change happen slowly, not radical big change. So those are two different viewpoints when people talk about the court system. Okay, judicial activism. People generally do not like the idea of what they call activist judges. Okay. Okay, so we've zoomed through a lot. Kind of zoomed in on some good details of the judicial system. Any questions?
I have a question about how did you call it? Precedent? How, for example, if I have some issue and I want to go to court, how can I know if there any precedent happened before my situation so I can use it?
Well, I mean, that's why
Do we have any information, like public information about court decisions?
That's a good question. I suppose that's why we pay lawyers so much, is because there's an ocean of knowledge. Because when you bring a case to a lawyer and you say, I have this problem, I think I'd like to take it to court, and you need to do that through a lawyer is going to be able to answer that question. Well, you know what? this type of situation has already been addressed by the courts, and this is how they ruled. When you look at lawyers' offices, they have shelves and shelves and shelves of books, and they're called case books or case studies, and it's literally just books about past cases, like across the country, I suppose, summarizing the issues, the questions that were answered, the issues that came up. As far as like what resources are available to us just as regular people, that's a good question. I don't really know. I suppose you could just start Googling something and see what you can find, but it's complicated. It's a really complicated system, especially when you have to take into account all kinds of information that you don't know, right? You could have an issue with somebody, and you don't know if that sort of topic ever came up in front of a court before, and if it did, how did they rule? What's the reasoning? You don't know. I guess that's why lawyers make so much money, because it's a really complicated system. But they do try to follow that
Thank you.
precedent, you know.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
No, I don't have any other questions.
Okay. Well, again, I put in the chat my email. Feel free to email me again. If you do, I'll send you directly this document. And it has a couple of, I put in a few other links you can click on, a few other readings, and one video. So I'm happy to share the resources I have. Send me an email if you want. But I appreciate you folks logging in. It's an exciting week of news, and I think frankly, this whole year is going to be kind of crazy with the elections. And I personally, I like watching the Olympics, and we got the Olympics coming up at the end of the summer. It's going to be a busy year, but I think it'll be interesting to watch things unfold. And you're lucky enough that you get to hopefully we learn as we go and things happen. So yeah, thanks for logging in, and have a great day, everybody.
Thank
You
you so
too.
much
Thanks
for this
for having
lesson.
us.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.